Chapter 1, The Weight of Gold Leaf and Concrete. The heavy, stagnant air of a late June evening hung low over the city, trapping the day's relentless heat against the asphalt and the worn stone facades of the historic district. In the belly of the old Renaissance theater, the suffocating atmosphere felt even denser, smelling of decades of trapped dust, damp plaster, and the sharp, chemical tang of chemical solvents. Elena stood on the skeletal scaffolding, her fingers tracing the faded gold leaf of a carved cherub on the proscenium arch. The theater was a relic of a grander era, a beautiful, bruised giant that the modern world seemed entirely content to let crumble into oblivion. For months, it had been her sanctuary and her cage. Every fracture in the molding, every peeling layer of velvet on the balcony rails felt like a reflection of her own internal landscape, stately, quiet, and slowly wearing away under the weight of time. She dipped her fine-tipped brush into the solvent, her movements precise and mechanical, a rhythmic dance born of years of discipline. Yet, beneath the practiced calm of her hands, a restless anxiety hummed in her veins, as persistent as the distant drone of city traffic filtering through the cracked stained-glass windows above. Through the gaps in the scaffolding, she could see the silhouette of Julien standing near the center aisle of the orchestra pit. Even in the dim, amber glow of the temporary work lamps, his presence was grounding, a familiar anchor in a world that felt increasingly fluid. He was hunched over a folding table strewn with blueprints and structural schematics, a pencil tucked behind his ear, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. Julien looked at the world through a lens of physics and geometry, where others saw ruin, he saw stress loads, weight distribution, and columns requiring reinforcement. For 7 years, that absolute certainty had been Elena's comfort. They had built a life together on a foundation as solid as the concrete foundations he poured for a living. But tonight, the silence stretching between them felt vast, an ocean of unsaid words that the summer heat only seemed to expand. He hadn't looked up in over an hour, entirely consumed by the mathematical equations required to keep the ancient roof from collapsing under its own weight. Elena watched him, a bittersweet ache tightening in her chest. She loved his devotion, his unwavering stability, but there were moments during this oppressive summer when she felt that if he didn't look at her, truly look at her, past the logistics of the restoration, she might simply fade into the shadows of the gallery. The quiet geometry of their evening was abruptly shattered by a sudden shift in the light from the massive arched entryway at the back of the auditorium. The heavy wooden doors, warped by the humidity, groaned open to reveal the stark, neon-pink glow of a street sign from the alleyway, casting a long, distorted shadow across the dusty floorboards. Marc walked in, carrying a crate of spray cans that rattled with every step, his movements possessing a loose, fluid energy that instantly disrupted the stagnant air of the theater. He was an anomaly in this space of preservation, a man whose entire artistic philosophy was built on the ephemeral, the temporary, and the loud. Commissioned to paint a massive contemporary mural on the exterior brick wall that connected the theater to the neighboring alley, he had spent the last week treating the historic building like a living canvas. Where Elena sought to meticulously anchor the past, Marc wanted to force it into a chaotic conversation with the present. He threw his jacket onto a velvet seat that had long since lost its spring, oblivious to the sacred quiet he was invading. Julien finally looked up from his blueprints, a flicker of polite but weary tolerance crossing his features, before returning to his calculations. Elena, however, remained frozen on her perch, her brush hovering a millimeter above the plaster, acutely aware that the temperature in the room had suddenly seemed to rise. From her balcony apartment directly across the narrow cobblestone street, Simone watched the theater doors close, the glowing tip of her cigarette cutting a thin arc of amber through the darkness of the humid night. She sat in a wicker chair surrounded by dying geraniums, a silk robe draped over her frail shoulders, looking down at the world like an old queen surveying a diminished court. For decades, her voice had filled that very theater, her operatic crescendos commanding the adoration of the city's elite. Now, the music was gone, replaced by the rasp of old lungs and the sharp, cynical observations of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the opening chords of a tragedy before the actors even knew their lines. She had watched Elena and Julien arrive every morning, their movements synchronized and predictable, a well-rehearsed duet of domestic comfort. But over the last week, she had also watched Marc arrive, his loud laughter echoing up the alleyway, his eyes lingering just a second too long on the scaffolding where Elena worked. Simone took a slow, deliberate drag of her cigarette, her sharp eyes narrowing as she noted the subtle shift in the theater's internal light. She knew the volatile ingredients that were currently mixing in that dusty auditorium, and a faint, knowing smile touched her lips. The city summer was a crucible, and she intended to watch exactly what melted under the heat. Up on the scaffolding, Elena forced herself to look away from the newcomer, focusing her eyes back on the minute details of the cherub's wing. But the silence had changed, it was no longer heavy with routine, but charged with an unspoken tension. Marc began to shake a can of paint, the marble inside rattling with a sharp, rhythmic click that echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a frantic heartbeat. The sound seemed to vibrate through the wooden planks beneath Elena's feet, a jarring reminder of a world outside this tomb of dust and gold leaf, a world that was vibrant, dangerous, and utterly unpredictable. She could hear the rustle of his footsteps as he moved toward the base of the scaffolding, the scent of fresh acrylic paint and summer rain beginning to overtake the ancient smell of the theater, signaling the undeniable arrival of a storm that none of them were prepared to weather. Chapter 2, The Geometry of a Shadow. The morning sun brought no relief to the city, rising instead like a pale, blinding sheet of copper that baked the brick alleyways and turned the stagnant air into a heavy, shimmering haze. Inside the Renaissance Theater, the heat of the previous night had remained trapped, marrying the scent of centuries-old dust with the sharp, fresh aroma of Marc's spray paint. Elena climbed the scaffolding early, her fingers still stained with the gold leaf fixative from the night before, but her focus was entirely fractured. From her elevated vantage point, the grand auditorium looked different now, less like a sanctuary of preservation and more like a battlefield of conflicting intents. She kept her eyes trained on the intricate plasterwork of the proscenium arch, but her ears were acutely tuned to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of Marc's aerosol cans echoing from the adjacent alley wall. Every burst of spray felt like an intrusion into her meticulously ordered world, a loud, modern heartbeat disrupting the silent graveyard of the past she was trying so desperately to resurrect. Down below, Julien was already a fixture of the space, moving with a quiet, deliberate intensity that defied the oppressive humidity. He had begun the physical reinforcement of the lower support columns, his hands covered in gray stone dust as he mixed a specialized structural compound. To Julien, the theater was a complex equation of gravity and resistance, a puzzle where every stress fracture could be solved with the right calculation and the proper application of force. He did not look at the fading beauty of the frescoes or the tragic romance of the abandoned stage, he looked at the load-bearing beams and saw a duty to protect, an unyielding commitment to keep the roof from caving in on Elena's dream. Yet, this very dedication created a wall of isolation around him. He moved around the perimeter of the auditorium like a ghost bound to his labor, completely oblivious to the fact that while he was successfully anchoring the physical foundation of the building, the emotional ground beneath his feet was silently shifting. Elena watched him from above, her heart heavy with a mixture of profound gratitude and a terrifying, growing sense of loneliness that no amount of structural concrete could seem to fill. The contrast became undeniable whenever Marc entered the auditorium to retrieve more supplies or to step back and judge his progress through the towering, unwashed windows. He moved with an effortless, fluid grace that seemed entirely unbothered by the suffocating climate, his t-shirt smeared with streaks of cobalt blue and neon orange. When he stood at the base of the scaffolding, looking up toward Elena, he didn't see a restorer hidden in the shadows, he saw a vibrant spirit trapped inside a tomb. He would deliberately leave his sketches scattered on the empty orchestra seats, bold, chaotic slashes of color that presented a stark, almost violent contrast to Julien's neat, black and white architectural blueprints. Elena found her gaze drawn to those sketches against her own will, recognizing in their wild, temporary nature a freedom she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The air between the scaffolding and the floor became thick with a mutual awareness, an unspoken tension that grew with every passing hour of the sweltering afternoon, building an invisible bridge between the woman who preserved the past and the man who lived exclusively for the fleeting present. Across the cobblestones, Simone observed the slow dance from her shaded terrace, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she sipped a glass of iced tea that had long since melted into lukewarm water. From her high vantage point, The alley and the open theater doors formed a perfect stage, and she was the solo audience member privy to the opening movements of a dangerous overture. She watched Julien labor over his concrete, his back straight and unbending, and then watched Marc step into the alley, wiping sweat from his forehead with an energy that was altogether too familiar to her. Simone knew the exact anatomy of desire and the inevitable cost of summer distractions. She had traded her own stability for passion decades ago on that very stage, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and an estranged family. Seeing Marc down there, pouring his restless soul onto a brick wall while Elena watched from the heights, stirred a complex mixture of bitterness and dark amusement in the old diva's chest. She leaned against the iron railing, her fingers tapping a theatrical rhythm, already deciding how she would intervene to accelerate the inevitable collision. Chapter 3: The Midsummer Friction. The heatwave reached its zenith by the following Tuesday, turning the city streets into shimmering corridors of reflected light and forcing the inhabitants into the deep, shaded recesses of stone buildings. Inside the theater, the air had grown so thick it felt almost tangible, a heavy blanket that slowed every movement and magnified every sound. Elena sat on the lower tier of the scaffolding, the fine camel hair brush resting idle in her lap. Her hands, usually so steady, felt heavy, weighted down by a strange, creeping lethargy that had less to do with the temperature and more to do with the overwhelming sensory overload of her surroundings. To her left, the grand, peeling fresco she was meant to be cleaning seemed to mock her with its permanent, unchanging perfection. To her right, the massive open loading doors revealed a slice of the alleyway, where Marc was working on the upper section of his mural, balanced precariously on a metal ladder. The sharp, rhythmic clack-clack of the mixing ball inside his aerosol cans had become the soundtrack to her thoughts, a persistent metronome driving a wedge into her concentration. Julien was working in the basement vaults, entirely hidden from view, though the vibrations of his heavy masonry drill occasionally shuddered through the floorboards, a subterranean reminder of his tireless, uncomplaining labor. He had spent the morning reinforcing the ancient brick arches beneath the stage, sweating through his canvas work shirt in the damp, dark underbelly of the building. For Julien, love was not a feeling to be discussed or a poem to be painted, it was an act of preservation, a tangible bulwark erected against decay. He believed that by stabilizing the foundation, he was securing their future, unaware that the structure he was trying to save was already tilting on an entirely different axis. Elena looked down at the dark opening of the basement stairs, feeling a profound wave of guilt wash over her. She knew the depth of his devotion, yet the silence he maintained felt less like a protective shield and more like a wall of indifference. The absence of connection in the sweltering heat was becoming unbearable, leaving her vulnerable to the vibrant, chaotic energy radiating from the alleyway. That energy broke through the threshold when a sudden gust of hot wind swept through the loading doors, blowing a flurry of Marc's loose charcoal sketches across the floorboards of the stage. One of the papers drifted toward the base of Elena's scaffolding, landing face up in a patch of sunlight. Unable to resist, she climbed down, her boots clicking softly on the dust-covered wood. She picked up the sheet, her breath catching as she looked at the charcoal lines. It wasn't a sketch of the mural, but a rapid, expressive study of a hand holding a restoration brush, her hand. The lines were urgent, messy, and filled with a raw vitality that completely captured the tension she had been hiding all week. When she looked up, Marc was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the blinding white light of the street. He didn't move or speak, merely wiping a streak of black charcoal across his brow, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the surrounding heat seem to vanish. In that prolonged silence, a boundary was crossed without a single word being spoken, an acknowledgement of an attraction that was fast becoming a consuming fire. From her balcony, Simone witnessed the silent exchange through her opera glasses, her wrinkled hands gripping the brass casing with surprising strength. She noticed the way Elena held the sketch, the defensive posture of her shoulders melting away, and the way Marc remained perfectly still in the doorway, uncharacteristically subdued. A sharp, knowing smile creased the old woman's face, though it was quickly replaced by a shadow of melancholy. This was the exact point of no return she had crossed 40 years ago, a moment where the comfort of safety lost its battle against the allure of the unknown. She knew that the friction between Julien's unyielding concrete and Marc's volatile paint was about to ignite, and she had no intention of staying a passive spectator. Reaching for a heavy, silver-embossed invitation card on her table, a relic from her days at the opera, she began to formulate a plan to bring the trio into her own domain, eager to play the conductor to a symphony of inevitable chaos. Chapter 4: The Delivery of the Silver Card. The late afternoon storm that had been promising to break all week never arrived, leaving instead an electric, static charge in the air that made everyone's skin itch and the city feel entirely on edge. Inside the auditorium, the tension had reached a physical density, hanging in the airspace between the high proscenium arch and the dusty floorboards like an unexploded charge. Elena had returned to her scaffolding, but she was no longer working. Her tools lay clean and organized on the wooden plank beside her, while her mind replayed the silent collision of glances from earlier that morning. The charcoal sketch she had retrieved from the stage was now safely hidden inside her leather satchel, a secret weight that seemed to pull at her conscious thought with every breath. Every time she looked down at the dark opening of the basement stairs where Julien remained buried in his work, a cold spike of dread pierced through her attraction to Marc, leaving her suspended in a miserable limbo of her own making. The physical division between the three of them was made manifest by their locations, creating a triangle of isolation within the cavernous room. Julien finally emerged from the subterranean vaults just as the city clock struck 5, his face pale with exhaustion and his shoulders dusted with white mortar residue. He moved heavily, carrying a bucket of discarded brick fragments toward the alley doors, his mind still locked in the structural mathematics of the building's foundation. He passed right by Marc's sketches without seeing them, his focus entirely consumed by the tangible reality of weight and resistance. Marc, meanwhile, was packing away his paints for the evening, his movements uncharacteristically subdued and tense as he carefully avoided looking up at the scaffolding. The easy, fluid confidence that usually defined his presence had vanished, replaced by a rigid, watchful stillness. The air between the two men was charged with an unspoken friction, a basic incompatibility of worldviews that required no words to be felt by everyone in the room. The static silence was broken not by a sound, but by the unexpected arrival of an object that forced their separate worlds to collide. A young courier, dressed in a crisp uniform that looked entirely too clean for the dusty environment, stepped through the grand entrance of the theater, holding a tray that bore a single, thick envelope. The paper was an exquisite, heavy stock of a faded silver hue, embossed with a vintage theatrical crest that Elena recognized instantly from old opera programs. Without a word, the courier handed the envelope to Julien, who was the closest to the door, before turning and vanishing back into the sweltering evening heat. Julien wiped his hands on a rag and broke the wax seal, his brow furrowing as he scanned the elegant, spidery handwriting inside. It was an invitation from Simone, requesting the presence of the restoration team and the alley artist at her balcony apartment across the street that very evening for a private dinner to discuss the artistic future of the district. Julien held the silver card out toward Elena, his expression a mixture of confusion and mild annoyance at the disruption to his schedule. Elena climbed down the scaffolding slowly, her heart beating with a sudden, erratic rhythm as she took the paper from his hand. She looked across the auditorium at Marc, who had stopped what he was doing and was watching them with a guarded expression. Elena could feel the deliberate intention behind the invitation. She knew that Simone was not merely being a hospitable neighbor. The old diva was pulling the strings, drawing them out of the safety of their work environments and forcing them into a confined, intimate space where the simmering secrets of the week would have no choice but to boil over. As Elena looked through the open doors toward the dark balcony across the cobblestones, she felt a profound sense of inevitability, realizing that the protective walls of the theater would no longer save them from themselves. Chapter 5: The Glass Threshold. The transition from the raw, dust-choked air of the theater to the claustrophobic opulence of Simone's apartment felt like stepping into another century. The sweltering city heat followed them across the narrow cobblestone alleyway, but once inside the threshold, it was immediately replaced by the heavy, suffocating sense of dried jasmine, old parchment, and the bitter tang of French vermouth. The apartment was a gilded museum of a forgotten era, crowded with velvet-draped furniture, tarnished silver mirrors that distorted the dim candlelight, and walls obscured by framed opera posters from Simone's glorious youth. The twilight outside was fading into a deep, bruised purple, casting long, dramatic shadows across the Persian rugs. Elena stepped into the room first, her posture stiff and unyielding, acutely aware of the dust on her denim trousers and the gold leaf residue still shimmering faintly on her cuticles. She felt entirely exposed in this setting of faded luxury, a stark contrast to the utilitarian comfort of her daily workspace. Julien followed closely behind her, his presence characteristically solid but entirely out of place among the fragile antiques. He had made a token effort to presentable, swapping his dust-covered work shirt for a clean linen one, but the grey stone residue still clung to the creases of his leather boots. He moved with a cautious, rigid precision, keeping one hand resting protectively on the small of Elena's back, a familiar, possessive gesture that tonight felt more like a heavy iron shackle than a comfort. To Julien, this evening was a civic obligation, a polite nod to a wealthy eccentric neighbor who held a considerable amount of influence in the historical preservation community. He did not sense the invisible currents sweeping through the room, he merely saw a cluttered apartment that defied his innate desire for order and structural efficiency. He stood near a heavy mahogany sideboard, his eyes tracking the slight unevenness of the floorboards, completely oblivious to the emotional trap that was being laid around him. Marc was the last to cross the threshold, and his entry immediately altered the air pressure in the room. He had not changed his clothes, arriving in the same paint-splattered black t-shirt he had worn all day, yet he carried himself with a fluid, rebellious ease that suggested he belonged in this theatrical environment far more than Julien ever could. He did not look at the art or the luxury, his dark, restless eyes immediately sought out Elena, anchoring his gaze to hers across the crowded parlor. The silent tension that had been building between them all week under the high arches of the theater seemed to condense in the small space, a palpable warmth that competed with the humid air filtering through the open balcony doors. Elena forced herself to look away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but the damage was already done. The simple geometry of the room had forced the romantic trio into an intimate, unavoidable alignment, and the absence of words only magnified the danger of their proximity. At the center of it all sat Simone, ensconced in a high-backed velvet armchair like a monarch awaiting her court. She wore a cascading robe of emerald silk, her heavily ringed fingers resting on the carved silver handle of a walking cane she rarely used. Her face, a map of deep lines and sharp angles, was illuminated by the flickering glow of a candelabra, making her dark eyes appear extraordinarily large and predatory. She watched the three of them assemble, her gaze lingering with a calculated, malicious pleasure on the stiff posture of Julien's arm around Elena, and then shifting to the fierce, unblinking intensity in Marc's eyes. Simone raised her glass of vermouth in a silent, mocking toast to their arrival, a thin, knowing smile playing on her crimson lips. She was entirely in her element, preparing to conduct a human drama of her own design, fueled by her own bitter nostalgia and a deep-seated desire to see the comfortable facade of safety shatter. With a slow, deliberate wave of her hand, she gestured toward the candlelit dining table near the open balcony, signaling that the overture was over and the main performance was about to begin. Chapter 6, The Unraveling Banquet. The heavy silver forks clicked against the fine porcelain plates with a sharp, metallic rhythm that seemed to punctuate the thick silence of the dining room. Simone's table was laden with an extravagant assortment of cold meats, ripe figs bursting from the heat, and deep red wine that caught the flickering candlelight like spilled blood. Yet, despite the richness of the spread, no one was eating. The air coming off the open balcony was breathless and heavy, carrying the distant, low rumble of thunder from a storm that still refused to break over the city skyline. Elena kept her eyes fixed firmly on her plate, her fingers tightly wrapped around the stem of her wine glass to hide their trembling. Every shadow cast by the candelabra seemed to stretch across the linen tablecloth toward her, pinning her to her seat. She could feel the heat of Marc's presence directly across from her, an invisible current that passed through the crystal bowls and silver platters, making it nearly impossible for her to breathe. Julien sat to her right, a monument of oblivious determination. He ate with the same methodical, efficient precision that he applied to mixing mortar, his movements mechanical and detached from the intense psychological atmosphere of the room. At one point, noticing the pale sheen of sweat on Elena's collarbone, he reached over and placed his heavy, calloused hand over hers, offering a reassuring squeeze that was meant to be comforting. To Elena, however, the touch felt like a brand of ownership, a public declaration of a history they shared that she was secretly beginning to betray. She did not pull her hand away, but her entire body went rigid beneath his touch, a subtle shift in posture that did not escape the notice of the other two people at the table. Marc's jaw tightened visibly, his eyes dropping to where Julien's fingers covered Elena's skin, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his own napkin. The silent declaration of war between the two men was now laid bare on the table, requiring no words to establish its boundaries. Simone sat at the head of the table, sipping her wine with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of a spectator watching a perfectly rehearsed tragedy unfold. She was the only one who seemed entirely unaffected by the suffocating heat, her sharp eyes darting between Julien's calm demeanor and the volatile energy vibrating between Marc and Elena. With a calculated, sweeping movement of her emerald silk sleeve, she reached across the table and picked up a heavy leather-bound photo album, placing it deliberately in the center of the clearing between their plates. She opened it to a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young man standing in front of the very same Renaissance theater decades ago, a man with the exact same defiant stance, the same restless eyes, and the same dark curls as Marc. It was Simone's son, the child she had abandoned in her pursuit of the stage, and the father Marc had grown up hating in absentia. The revelation hung in the air like a physical blow. Marc froze, his gaze locking onto the photograph as the blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a pale, stark gray beneath the candlelight. He looked up at Simone, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce realization of why she had commissioned him, why she had watched him from her balcony, and the depth of the manipulation that had drawn him into this city crucible. Elena watched the silent horror dawn on Marc's face, her own breath catching in her throat as she realized that none of them were here by chance, they were all pieces in a grand, bitter game of penance and revenge designed by the old diva. Julien looked at the photo, then at Marc, his engineering mind finally stalling as he tried to process a connection that defied logic or calculation. The comfortable facade of their evening had completely disintegrated, leaving them trapped in the flickering shadows of Simone's past, while the storm outside finally began to lash the windowpanes with the first heavy drops of rain. Chapter 7, The Downpour and the Scaffold. The sky above the city finally ruptured, releasing a torrential summer deluge that struck the cobblestones below like a volley of iron beads. The sudden onslaught of water did nothing to cool the air, instead, it transformed the night into a steaming, breathless void, washing away the neon reflections on the pavement and replacing them with a chaotic, shimmering gray. Inside Simone's apartment, the heavy rain lashed against the open balcony doors, spraying a fine mist across the Persian rugs and causing the candles to flicker violently before dying out, leaving the room illuminated only by the stark, periodic flashes of lightning that ripped through the city skyline. Marc was the first to move, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor as he stood up, his entire body rigid with an anger that had been simmering for years. He turned away from the table, ignoring the ghost in the sepia photograph and the predatory gaze of his grandmother, and rushed out into the storm, abandoning the claustrophobic museum of Simone's regrets. Elena stood up a second later, driven by a raw, unthinking panic that completely overrode her years of practiced restraint. The sight of Marc's unraveling had shattered something fundamental within her, making it impossible to remain under the suffocating weight of Julien's protective hand. She ran toward the exit without looking back, her boots splashing into the pooling water of the alleyway as she chased the silhouette of the artist through the blinding rain. Behind her, Julien was left standing in the shadows of the dining room, the heavy silver card still clutched in his hand, his analytical mind struggling to calculate the trajectory of a collapse he had never anticipated. He looked at the empty chairs, then out at the storm-swept alley, the realization of his own isolation finally beginning to dawn on him as the thunder shook the very foundations of the block. The heavy, warped wooden doors of the Renaissance theater offered no real protection from the fury of the storm. The wind howled through the cracked stained-glass windows of the upper gallery, sending sheets of water cascading down the interior brick walls and pooling on the historic stage. Marc stood at the base of his unfinished mural, his hands covered in wet, running paint as he stared up at the massive canvas that had become his prison. When Elena burst through the doors, her hair matted to her forehead and her clothes soaked through by the deluge, he did not turn around, but his shoulders dropped in a silent admission of defeat. The silence between them inside the cavernous, echoing auditorium was louder than the thunder outside, filled with the undeniable weight of an attraction that had survived the crucible of Simone's dining room and was now exposed to the elements. Elena moved closer, her footsteps leaving wet tracks on the dust-covered floorboards until she was standing just inches from him, her breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the high proscenium arch. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the soaked fabric of his sleeve, wanting to offer a comfort she had no right to give. Before she could touch him, a sharp, terrifying crack resounded from the roof high above them, followed by the groan of twisting metal. The weight of the rainwater had accumulated on the compromised section of the uncompleted roof, and the ancient timbers were beginning to give way. In the dim light of a flash of lightning, Elena looked up to see a massive shadow detaching itself from the ceiling directly above the scaffolding where her life's work lay waiting, and below it, a figure was sprinting through the grand entrance of the auditorium, his tool belt rattling as he rushed toward the danger. Chapter 8, The Falling Sky. The world inside the Renaissance theater dissolved into a terrifying symphony of splitting timber and grinding iron as the central portion of the old roof succumbed to the weight of the summer deluge. The structural failure did not happen in a single, clean break, but in a horrific, slow-motion sequence of cascading collapses that reverberated through the hollow belly of the auditorium. Sheets of heavy plaster and centuries-old insulation rained down onto the orchestra seats, creating a thick, blinding cloud of white dust that mixed with the incoming torrents of water to form a suffocating gray mud on the floorboards. In the center of the chaos stood Julien, his silhouette illuminated by the jagged flashes of lightning cutting through the newly formed chasm in the ceiling. He had not run into the building to salvage the historic architecture or to protect his own heavy machinery, he had run toward the skeletal scaffolding where Elena had spent her summer, driven by a frantic, single-minded instinct to shield her life's work from total annihilation. Elena watched from the safety of the rear exit, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream that the thunder would have drowned out anyway. Through the shifting veil of dust and rain, she saw Julien launch himself onto the lower tier of the metal structure just as a massive, waterlogged beam from the ceiling gave way directly above them. In that split second, the true nature of Julien's silent devotion was laid completely bare. He was not a man who could articulate the depth of his affection through romantic gestures or artistic declarations, but he was a man who would willingly throw his body between a falling mountain and the woman he loved. As the beam dropped, Julien didn't retreat, he braced his back against the primary support column of the scaffolding, his muscles straining against the immense, physics-defying weight in a desperate bid to keep the entire iron frame from buckling onto the stage where Marc's unfinished mural lay completely exposed. Marc did not hesitate. The artistic detachment and the bitter resentment that had paralyzed him all evening evaporated the moment he saw another man risk his life in the ruins. Moving with the explosive, reckless speed that defined his style, he bolted across the slick, mud-streaked stage, sliding beneath the twisting iron rods to reach Julien's side. The contrast between the two men disappeared under the shared equalizer of survival. The free-spirited nomad and the rigid structural engineer were forced into a brutal, physical alliance, their hands gripping the same freezing metal bars as they fought together to prevent a total structural collapse. Marc leveraged his body weight against the leaning scaffolding, taking a portion of the crushing load onto his own shoulders, his fingers locking onto the iron next to Julien's dust-covered hands. In that silent, agonizing pocket of time beneath the falling sky, the rivalry between them ceased to exist, replaced by a mutual, visceral understanding of what it meant to fight for the same center of gravity. Elena ran into the wreckage, her boots slipping on the wet plaster as she reached the base of the trembling structure. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone, ozone, and fresh paint washing off the walls in long, colorful ribbons of blue and orange. She did not try to pull them away, she knew that if either man let go, the remaining ceiling would bring the rest of the theater down upon them all. Instead, she reached through the tangle of iron rods, her hands pressing firmly against Julien straining back while her eyes locked onto Marc's pale, sweat-streaked face. The three of them formed a human tripod of resistance against the storm, bound together by a web of guilt, sacrifice, and an intense, consuming love that had finally broken through its structural boundaries. High above them, on her dark balcony across the street, Simone stood frozen against the iron railing, her opera glasses dropped to the floor as she watched the literal and metaphorical collapse of the stage she had built, realizing too late that the tragedy she had conducted was no longer under her control. Chapter 9, The Pale Solstice. The storm retreated before dawn, leaving the city washed in a cold, slate-gray light that felt entirely detached from the violent heat of the previous week. A thick, wet mist rose from the damp cobblestones of the alleyway, creeping under the warped wooden doors of the Renaissance Theatre and settling over the wreckage like a shroud. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow drip of rainwater falling from the jagged hole in the roof onto the mountain of ruined plaster below. The air was cold now, smelling sharply of wet lime, stagnant puddles, and the faint, chemical ghost of Marc's ruined mural. Elena sat on an upturned velvet orchestra seat near the back of the auditorium, her knees pulled tight against her chest, her fingers tracing a dried streak of cobalt blue paint that had splattered onto her forearm during the chaos. She had not slept, her eyes fixed on the center of the stage where the skeletal scaffolding still stood, bent and warped like an iron ribcage, but miraculously upright. The physical cost of the night was written in the quiet movements of the two men who remained at the site, separated by a vast distance of debris and unsaid truths. Julien was kneeling near the base of the proscenium arch, his hands covered in a mixture of white dust and dried blood where the rough iron had bitten into his palms. He was methodically packing his engineering tools into a heavy canvas bag, his movements slow, deliberate, and devoid of the mechanical urgency that had driven him all summer. He did not look up at the ruined fresco or at the chasm in the ceiling, his analytical mind had finally finished its calculations, and the conclusion was undeniable. Embracing his body to save the structure, he had finally felt the true direction of the weight, he had realized that the foundation he had spent 7 years building was not holding Elena up, but holding her down. His devotion remained intact, but it had shifted from a desire to possess to a quiet, heartbreaking acceptance of structural failure. Marc stood near the open loading doors, his silhouette framed by the pale morning mist of the alley. His right shoulder was heavily bandaged with a strip of linen torn from an old theater curtain, a dark shadow of bruising already blooming beneath the white fabric where he had taken the brunt of the shifting iron. He was uncharacteristically still, his restless hands buried deep in his pockets as he stared out at the quiet city streets. The chaotic, fleeting energy that had defined his arrival had been entirely burned away by the adrenaline of the collapse. He had risked everything for a building he didn't care about and a man he barely knew, driven purely by the sudden, terrifying realization that Elena's world was fragile enough to break. Yet, as he watched the morning light slowly illuminate the ruined auditorium, the weight of his own history seemed to anchor him to the spot. He was no longer a nomad passing through, but a man who had left a permanent mark on the stone, and who had been permanently marked in return. From her high vantage point across the cobblestones, Simone watched the quiet aftermath through the open pane of her terrace window, the silver-embossed invitation card from the previous evening lying crumpled on the floorboards by her feet. For the first time in decades, the old diva looked her true age, her frail shoulders hunched beneath her emerald robe, her sharp eyes clouded with a profound, sobering quiet. The human comedy she had attempted to direct had refused to follow her script. Instead of a tidy drama of penance and poetic revenge, she had nearly engineered the destruction of the only family she had left. She did not reach for her opera glasses or her cigarettes, she simply sat in the cold morning air, watching her grandson stand in the threshold of the theater, realizing that the ultimate cost of her lifelong performance was to remain a silent spectator to a resolution she could no longer influence. Elena finally stood up, her boots making a soft, crunching sound on the plaster dust as she walked down the center aisle toward the stage. She stopped at the precise midpoint between the two men, between the anchor of her past and the catalyst of her present. No words were spoken in the vast, ruined space, the silent architecture of their shared sacrifice had made language entirely redundant. Julien buckled his canvas bag, swung it over his uninjured shoulder, and walked toward the grand entrance without a backward glance, leaving his blueprints behind on the dust-covered table. Marc turned from the alley door, his dark eyes locking onto Elena's as he took a single step forward into the auditorium, his hand reaching out to meet hers in the quiet space where the ceiling had fallen, beginning the slow, tentative process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage of a summer storm. Chapter 10, the texture of tomorrow. The city did not wait for the dust to settle inside the Renaissance Theater. Outside its thick stone walls, the relentless rhythm of a urban July marched on, bringing a new, dry heat that baked the mud in the alleys into a pale, cracked crust. A week had passed since the night the sky fell, and the ruined auditorium had been officially cordoned off by municipal safety barriers. Yet, the physical barriers meant very little to Elena, who spent her afternoons sitting on the low stone steps of the side entrance, where the smell of fresh timber from the temporary shoring beams mixed with the heavy scent of blooming linden trees. Her restoration tools remained locked in their wooden chest, but her hands were no longer idle. She carried a small, unlined notebook in her lap, her pen sketching the geometric outlines of the new steel trusses that would eventually replace the collapsed roof. The project was no longer about meticulous preservation of what had been lost, but about finding a way to integrate the scar into the design, allowing the light from the new chasm to become a permanent feature of the space. Julien's absence left a tangible void in the daily layout of the block, a quiet space where the heavy thud of his boots and the precise scratch of his pencil used to dictate the morning routine. He had transferred his contract to a municipal bridge project on the far eastern edge of the city, choosing to bury himself in the massive, impersonal logistics of steel and river currents rather than linger in the intimate ruin of the historic district. Elena had received a single package from his courier early on Friday morning, not a letter or a confrontation, but a neatly rolled set of structural assessments for the theater's remaining load-bearing columns, completed in his flawless, technical draftsmanship. It was his final gift, a silent assurance that even in his departure, he had ensured the ground beneath her feet would remain secure. Elena kept the blueprints on her work table, a monument to a love that had been real, solid, and brave enough to know when to let go. Marc had not fled the city as he had done so many times before when the air became too heavy with consequence. His ladder was still anchored to the alley wall, though he worked at a much slower pace now, his left arm doing most of the labor while his injured right shoulder slowly healed beneath his dark shirts. The contemporary mural was changing direction, the aggressive, chaotic slashes of neon orange and cobalt blue were being systematically overlaid with softer, earthier tones, mutes of ochre, slate gray, and a deep, shimmering gold leaf that he had carefully salvaged from Elena's discarded workshop supplies. He was no longer trying to shout over the history of the building, he was learning to paint within its fractures. Every evening when the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a warm amber glow down the alleyway, he would step down from his platform and sit on the stone steps next to Elena, his paint-stained fingers resting quietly next to her notebook, a silent anchor in her new world. Across the cobblestones, the heavy velvet drapes of Simone's balcony apartment remained drawn against the blinding summer glare, turning the old diva's sanctuary into a cool, shadowed tomb of memories. She did not emerge into the light, but the music had returned to the alleyway. From behind the closed glass doors, the faint, scratched recording of an old soprano aria drifted down to the street every afternoon, a fragile thread of sound that spoke of a pride that had been humbled but not completely broken. Simone had sent no more silver invitations, but she had left the sepia photograph of her son on the small table by her entrance door, a silent olive branch waiting for the day her grandson felt ready to cross the street. The crucible of the urban summer had run its course, burning away the illusions of safety and the bitterness of revenge, leaving the survivors to stand together in the quiet, unfolding architecture of their tomorrow. Chapter 11, The Golden Hour Arc. The midsummer sun began its slow, heavy descent over the city, casting long, liquid shadows of amber and violet through the exposed iron skeleton of the Renaissance Theater's roof. It was late afternoon, that precise moment in July when the urban heat loses its aggressive bite and softens into a warm, lingering haze that makes the stone facades appear almost luminous. Inside the auditorium, the dust had completely settled, replaced by the crisp, clean scent of newly milled pine planks and the faint, earthy aroma of drying mortar. Elena stood on a new, modern aluminum platform positioned near the center of the stage, her fingers gently sweeping over the freshly stabilized border of the grand proscenium fresco. The structural repairs were far from finished, but the emergency phase had passed. Now, the space felt alive with a different kind of energy, no longer a tomb of decaying memories, but an active intersection where the past was openly negotiating with the future. Her small notebook sat open on a nearby crate, its pages filled with sketches that merged Julien's precise engineering boundaries with the fluid, organic lines of the new architecture. Julien had sent one final technical dispatch earlier that afternoon, a clean, digitized schematic of the secondary reinforcement trusses, transmitted without a single personal note or signature, yet executed with the unmistakable, flawless precision that had defined his care for 7 years. Elena looked at the clean black lines on the screen of her tablet, feeling a profound, quiet gratitude that no longer carried the stinging weight of guilt. He was building his bridges on the Eastern River, anchoring massive spans of steel into the bedrock, doing exactly what he was meant to do. His departure had not been a collapse, but a deliberate, controlled dismantling of a structure that had run its course, leaving both of them with their foundations intact. Outside in the alleyway, the rhythmic, metallic whistle of a spray can signaled Marc's steady progress on the lower tier of the mural. He was working without the frantic, defensive speed of the previous months, his movements deliberate and attuned to the quiet atmosphere of the street. The massive brick wall had transformed into a striking visual dialogue. The sharp, rebellious streaks of his initial design were now anchored by sweeping bands of slate gray and muted ochre, echoing the geometric lines of the theater's interior ironwork. At the very center of the composition, where the brick had been scarred by the falling timber, he had applied a broad, textured layer of pure gold leaf that caught the setting sun like a beacon. He was no longer trying to erase the history of the space or fight against its gravity. He was learning the patient, meticulous language of preservation, letting her world reshape his art just as his chaos had shattered her isolation. Across the cobblestones, the high glass doors of Simone's balcony were propped open a few inches to let the evening breeze stir the heavy lace curtains. The scratched operatic recordings had ceased, replaced instead by the raw, unamplified sound of a grand piano being played with a slow, hesitant hand, a simple, melancholic scale that repeated itself over and over through the humid air. It was a tentative return to the living world, a quiet acknowledgement that the performance was over and the reality of family remained. Marc paused his work for a moment, his spray can lowering as the piano notes drifted down the alley, his eyes turning toward the shaded balcony with a look that was no longer guarded by anger, but open to the possibility of a shared history. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the alley into a cool, blue twilight, he climbed down his ladder and walked into the theater, his shadow stretching across the stage to meet Elena's in the warm, golden dust of their new beginning. Chapter 12, The Architecture of Light. The arrival of August brought a subtle shift in the city's color palette, bleaching the high stone cornices into a soft, chalky white and turning the evening sky into a deep, endless indigo. Inside the Renaissance Theater, the skeletal iron scaffolding had finally been disassembled, its cold metal pipes carried away on flatbed trucks to leave the vast auditorium completely open for the first time in months. The air inside no longer smelled of trapped dust or damp plaster, instead, it was filled with the clean, sharp scent of fresh glass sealant and the sweet, resinous aroma of polished oak. Elena stood at the very center of the empty orchestra floor, her head tilted back as she looked up at the completed restoration. The massive chasm in the ceiling had not been covered over with dark timber, instead, a sweeping, modern skylight of reinforced steel and clear glass had been anchored into the historic roof, transforming the ancient building into a vessel designed specifically to capture the movement of the sun and the stars. The architectural triumph was a living testament to a collaboration that had survived its own destruction. Julien's final structural blueprints, clean and unwrinkled, were now permanently framed in the theater's newly restored lobby, a silent monument to the man who had ensured the building could support its new vision. His name was etched into the steel foundation plate near the main entrance, a permanent part of the city's history that required no explanation or sentimentality to maintain its dignity. He had moved on to a massive railway infrastructure project in the north, his days now consumed by the macrogeography of long-distance tracks and concrete viaducts. Elena looked at his flawless, technical lines one last time before closing the lobby doors, recognizing that his love had been a masterclass in structural integrity, rigid enough to bear a crushing weight, and precise enough to leave a perfect template for a future he would not share. Outside, the alleyway had become a destination in its own right, drawing small crowds of evening pedestrians who stopped to marvel at the completed mural. Marc had finished the final section of the wall just as the first autumn leaves began to drift from the linden trees. The chaotic, rebellious spray paint of his youth had been entirely tamed by a new, masterly restraint. The sweeping bands of slate gray and ochre now mirrored the internal geometry of the theater's new ironwork, seamlessly bridging the gap between the street and the stage. The textured gold leaf he had applied to the central scar caught the fading twilight, glowing with an intense, fiery brilliance that illuminated the entire cobblestone passage. He no longer carried himself with the restless, nomadic anxiety of a man looking for an exit. His paint-spattered boots were firmly planted on the stone, his eyes quiet and fixed on the entrance of the theater where Elena stood waiting in the doorway. The final movement of the summer's symphony belonged across the street, where the heavy velvet curtains of Simone's apartment had been permanently tied back with gold silk cords. The old diva sat by her open window, the cool evening breeze catching the edges of her emerald robe as she watched the small crowd gather in the alley below. The grand piano inside her parlor remained silent tonight, but the silver invitation card was gone from her entrance table, replaced by a pair of keys to her son's old studio apartment, which she had quietly delivered to Marc's ladder earlier that morning. She did not seek a dramatic curtain call or a public reconciliation, she simply sat in the twilight, her sharp eyes softening as she watched her grandson step away from his mural and walk toward the theater doors. As the city lights began to flicker on across the urban landscape, casting a warm, geometric glow through the theater's new skylight, the three survivors stood together in the quiet space where the ceiling had fallen, ready to begin the first chapter of a story they would write entirely in the light. Chapter 13, The Echo of the First Frost. The transition from late summer into the crisp, sharp clarity of autumn happened overnight, turning the city's humid haze into a cool, brittle atmosphere that smelled of wood smoke and damp fallen leaves. By mid-September, the Renaissance Theater had officially reopened its doors to the public, no longer a hidden secret shared by a few stressed souls, but a vibrant cultural hub filled with the low hum of shifting crowds and the rustle of silk programs. Elena stood in the back row of the upper gallery, her hands resting on the newly varnished mahogany rail, looking down at the packed auditorium below. The modern skylight she had fought to integrate into the roof was now tracking the silver arc of an autumn moon, casting a clean, geometric shaft of light directly onto the center stage. She felt a profound sense of detachment from the frantic anxiety that had consumed her summer. The space had healed, its fractures filled with glass and steel, and her own internal landscape had settled into a quiet, unshakable peace. From her vantage point, she could see the physical manifestation of the choices that had reshaped her life. Down in the lobby, a small group of architecture students stood admiring the framed schematics that Julien had left behind, their fingers tracing the precise, unyielding lines of his structural calculations. Julien himself was miles away, his presence reduced to this indelible signature on the building's bones, but his legacy remained an absolute comfort. Elena had received a brief, formal postcard from him just 2 days prior, stamped from a small industrial town up north where his new suspension bridge was taking shape across a jagged river gorge. There were no regrets written in his neat, compact script, only a simple, professional update on the load-bearing capacities of his new project. It was his way of letting her know that he was still anchoring the world, still building foundations, but doing so on a scale that matched his vast, solitary nature. The alleyway outside had transformed into a living gallery, illuminated by soft, low-voltage spotlights that the city had installed to showcase Marc's completed mural. The gold leaf he had applied to the central scar of the brickwork seemed to burn with a steady, liquid fire under the night sky, drawing couples who lingered in the cool air to run their fingers over the textured surface. Marc was no longer the elusive ghost of the alley, he had moved his canvases into the small studio apartment across the street, the very space his father had occupied decades ago. He sat at the edge of the theater stage below Elena, a sketchbook resting on his knees, his pencil catching the rhythm of the arriving audience with a loose, confident grace that was no longer driven by the need to escape. He looked up toward the gallery, his dark eyes instantly finding Elena in the shadows, a quiet, knowing smile passing between them that required no grand gestures or spoken vows to confirm its permanence. Across the cobblestones, the glass doors of Simone's balcony were closed against the autumn chill, but the heavy velvet drapes remained wide open, allowing the warm, golden light of her parlor to spill out into the night. The old diva sat by her hearth, a heavy woolen shawl draped over her emerald robe, her sharp profile silhouetted against the roaring fire. She was no longer watching the street through opera glasses. Instead, she was listening to the muffled, symphonic sounds filtering out from the theater's open lobby, her expression one of deep, serene contentment. The isolation that had defined her existence for 40 years had dissolved into a quiet acceptance of the new generation's rhythm. As the house lights inside the auditorium began to dim, signaling the start of the season's first performance, Marc stood up from the stage, set his sketchbook down on an orchestra seat, and walked up the side stairs to join Elena in the dark gallery, their hands interlacing in the cool air as the curtain rose on a world they had built together from the ruins. Chapter 14, The Architecture of Winter. By the time late December descended upon the city, the oppressive, heavy heat of the summer had become nothing more than a distant, faded memory. The urban landscape was now defined by a sharp, biting frost that turned the breath of pedestrians into fleeting clouds of white mist and coated the cobblestones of the alleyway in a dangerous, glittering sheen of black ice. Inside the Renaissance Theatre, however, the climate was perfectly regulated, a warm, welcoming sanctuary against the harsh winter elements. The massive modern skylight that had replaced the collapsed roof was now framed by a delicate border of white frost, creating a striking contrast against the dark, star-filled winter sky above. Elena stood in the center of the grand lobby, her heavy woolen coat draped over her arm, watching the snow begin to fall softly through the reinforced glass panels, casting a quiet, geometric pattern of shadows across the polished oak floorboards. The theater had not just survived the summer crucible, it had thrived, becoming the heart of the historic district's cultural renaissance. The framed engineering schematics that Julien had left behind remained a permanent fixture near the box office, their neat, black lines a constant reminder of the invisible strength that kept the entire structure standing. Elena looked at them as she passed, her heart completely free of the old, suffocating guilt. Julien had sent a brief, professional card from his new assignment in the Alps, where he was supervising the construction of a massive high-altitude viaduct. The card contained no personal declarations, only a simple, technical note about the snow load capacities of the theater's new roof, executed in his unmistakable, flawless script. It was his unique way of maintaining a silent vigil over her dream, a distant but unyielding anchor that proved some foundations were built to survive any change of season. Outside, the alleyway was quiet, the usual evening crowds driven indoors by the freezing temperatures. Yet, Marc's mural remained a vibrant point of light in the winter darkness. The textured gold leaf he had applied to the central scar of the brickwork seemed to catch the glow of the street lamps with an even greater intensity now, burning like a warm, liquid flame against the backdrop of falling snow. Marc had spent the afternoon inside his new studio across the street, his canvases no longer capturing the frantic, chaotic energy of a nomad looking for an escape, but the deep, layered textures of a man who had finally chosen to stay. He walked into the theater lobby just as the main gallery doors were being closed for the night, his boots carrying a few stray flakes of snow, his dark eyes instantly finding Elena's across the crowded room with a quiet, grounded certainty that required no words to confirm its depth. Across the cobblestones, the high glass doors of Simone's balcony were tightly shut against the freezing wind, but the heavy velvet drapes were drawn completely back, allowing the brilliant, warm light of her fireplace to illuminate the snow-covered terrace. The old diva sat in her high-backed chair, a thick cashmere shawl wrapped around her emerald silk robe, her sharp profile silhouetted against the roaring flames. She was holding a small, leather-bound photo album in her lap, the very one that had laid bare the secrets of the past during that fateful summer dinner, but her expression was no longer clouded by bitterness or the desire for revenge. She looked down at the street below, watching her grandson step out of the theater doors with Elena, their hands interlaced as they walked together into the quiet winter night. The crucible of the summer had done its work, burning away the illusions and the walls of isolation, leaving the survivors to build a beautiful, enduring life together from the very architecture of their shared history. Chapter 15, The Solstice Renewal. The turn of the new year brought a rare, crystalline stillness to the city, a freezing clarity that seemed to freeze the very passage of time against the gray stone facades of the historic district. By late January, the intense holiday crowds had thinned, leaving the Renaissance Theatre to settle into a quiet, rhythmic winter routine. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a thick, pristine blanket of white on the modern glass skylight above the auditorium. Inside, the morning sun cut through the frost-rimmed glass panels in long, sharp pillars of light, illuminating the vast empty space with a clean, almost ethereal radiance. Elena stood on the freshly sealed wooden stage, a heavy ceramic mug of tea warming her hands, her eyes tracing the high proscenium arch where her restoration work was now fully complete. The gold leaf she had meticulously cleaned over the sweltering summer months now glowed with a soft, enduring light under the winter sun, no longer a relic of a decaying past, but a vibrant anchor for the theater's new lease on life. The structural stability of the entire enterprise remained an unyielding comfort, a silent testament to a partnership that had ended not in bitterness, but in mutual respect. Julien's framed blueprints in the main lobby had become a familiar landmark for visitors, their neat, black grid lines standing as a permanent reminder of the invisible skeleton keeping the old building safe. Earlier that week, Elena had received a formal engineering packet from his firm's headquarters, not a personal letter, but the official structural sign-off and insurance release for the theater's new roof, bearing his precise, unsmudged signature at the bottom of the final page. Julien was currently working on a massive coastal seawall project on the western peninsula, anchoring heavy stone barriers against the raw fury of the Atlantic winter currents. He was still fulfilling his true nature, dedicating his life to creating unyielding bulwarks against erosion and collapse, living a life built entirely on concrete facts, completely at peace with the distance he had placed between himself and the city. The alleyway outside was silent in the freezing morning air, but Marc's completed mural provided a stunning burst of color against the drab winter landscape. The broad bands of slate gray and ochre melted seamlessly into the surrounding brickwork, while the central layer of gold leaf caught the early morning sun, reflecting a warm, liquid light down the cobblestone passage like a permanent sunrise. Marc had spent the early morning hours inside his studio across the street, his canvases now depicting the quiet, structured beauty of the city's winter geometry rather than the chaotic, fleeting lines of his past nomadic life. He walked through the side stage door, dropping a heavy bundle of firewood near the lobby hearth, his boots crunching softly on the threshold. He didn't speak as he approached the stage, his dark eyes locked onto Elena's with a grounded, peaceful intensity that had been forged in the crucible of the summer storm. He simply stood beside her, his hand resting quietly on the wooden rail, content to share the vast, sunlit silence of the theater they had rebuilt together. Across the narrow street, the drapes of Simone's balcony apartment remained wide open, welcoming the pale winter light into the crowded, antique-filled parlor. The old diva was sitting at her grand piano, her frail fingers moving across the ivory keys with a new, fluid confidence, executing a bright, complex melody that echoed softly through the open pane of her terrace window. The bitter nostalgia that had consumed her for decades had finally transformed into a quiet, creative peace. She had stopped looking backward at her lost family and had begun to engage with the living reality of her grandson's presence on the block. She had even begun to leave a small wicker basket of fresh pastries on her doorstep every Tuesday morning for Marc to retrieve, a silent, daily ritual of reconciliation that required no dramatic confrontations to heal the old wounds. As the morning sun reached its zenith, casting a brilliant, warm glow through the theater's glass roof, the three survivors stood firmly rooted in their new lives, entirely ready to face whatever tomorrow would build in the light. Chapter 16, The Thaw of the First Spring. The bitter, unyielding grip of winter finally fractured in the second week of March, allowing a soft, damp breeze from the southern plains to sweep through the city's gray stone canyons. It was the season of the first true thaw, a time when the thick blankets of snow on the rooftops dissolved into 1,000 trickling streams, washing away the salt and grit from the cobblestones and leaving the urban landscape smelling faintly of wet earth and early moss. Inside the Renaissance Theater, the transformation was marked by a sudden, brilliant shift in the quality of the light. The frost that had rimmed the modern steel and glass skylight for months had melted away entirely, allowing the gentle morning sun to flood the grand auditorium with a pale, golden warmth that danced across the newly polished oak floorboards and breathed a renewed vitality into the restored frescoes of the proscenium arch. Elena stood on the upper mezzanine landing, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, watching the dust motes drift peacefully through the massive pillars of sunlight. The theater was no longer a site of frantic reconstruction or emergency bracing, it had successfully transitioned into a living, breathing monument to resilience. In the main lobby, the framed engineering schematics completed by Julien during the sweltering heat of the previous summer remained clean and pristine, a permanent fixture that drew the eyes of every visiting patron. Elena paused before them on her way down to the stage, her mind entirely at peace with the memory of the man who had drawn those lines. Julien had recently moved his operations further west, accepted as the lead consultant on a massive subterranean rail transit system beneath the capital city. He had sent a final, formal packet of maintenance certifications to her office just days prior, no letters, no personal check-ins, merely his signature stamped beside the official load-bearing seals. It was his characteristic way of ensuring that the theater would remain standing long after his departure, a quiet, distant guardianship that proved his love had always been about structural integrity rather than emotional display. Outside in the alleyway, the damp spring air carried the sharp, familiar scent of Marc's fresh oil paints. He had moved his easel out of his indoor studio and onto the cobblestones, working directly beneath the massive brick wall that housed his completed mural. The gold leaf he had applied to the central scar of the masonry caught the shifting morning light, gleaming with a soft, liquid intensity that seemed to welcome the changing season. His artwork had evolved dramatically since his arrival as a restless nomad. The chaotic, aggressive slashes of paint had been replaced by deeply layered, structured landscapes that captured the geometry of the city's architecture. He didn't speak as Elena stepped out of the side door to join him, merely shifting his posture to make room for her on the wooden bench, his paint-stained fingers reaching out to lace quietly through hers. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken secrets or the tension of a looming storm, but light, grounded, and entirely complete. Across the narrow street, the tall glass doors of Simone's balcony were propped wide open, letting the fresh spring air circulate through the heavy velvet drapes of her antique-filled apartment. The old diva sat near the iron railing, a light linen shawl replacing her heavy winter cashmere, her sharp profile illuminated by the bright morning sun. The grand piano inside her parlor was silent, but a small, hand-painted ceramic vase filled with the first yellow daffodils of the season had been placed prominently on her terrace ledge, facing the theater. It was a silent greeting to the street below, a clear sign that the walls of her self-imposed exile had permanently dissolved. As the city clocks began to strike noon, filling the alleyway with a deep, resonant chime, the three survivors stood firmly rooted in the warmth of their shared reality, completely ready to watch their new life unfold in the light of a new season. Chapter 17, The Solstice Meridian. The arrival of June brought the narrative arc back to its true beginning, completing a full geometric rotation of the seasons and wrapping the city once more in a high, brilliant midsummer glare. Yet, the atmosphere running through the cobblestone alleyways was entirely unrecognizable from the suffocating, heavy tension that had paralyzed the district exactly 1 year ago. The air was warm, smelling of sun-baked brick, dry lime, and the sweet, dizzying perfume of the white star jasmine climbing up the theater's eastern wall. Inside the Renaissance Theater, the modern steel and glass skylight stood open to the sky, allowing a gentle, circulating breeze to cool the cavernous auditorium below. Elena stood at the apex of the dress circle landing, her leather tool belt hanging loosely from her hip, her eyes scanning the grand space. The restoration was no longer a frantic race against decay or structural failure, it was a living, breathing reality, a fully realized sanctuary where the community now gathered beneath the high proscenium arch to witness the return of the arts to the old quarter. The structural ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, transformed into foundations rather than anchors. In the main lobby, the beautifully preserved engineering schematics drawn by Julien remained a focal point for visitors, their precise black ink lines an enduring monument to the man who had physically held the ceiling aloft when the world collapsed. Elena looked at the blueprint grid one quiet morning, feeling only a profound, crystalline gratitude. Julien had moved his operations across the ocean, having been appointed as the chief structural director for a historic harbor fortification project in the Pacific Northwest. He had sent her a brief, formal package containing the final, long-term stability certifications for the theater's central trusses, accompanied not by a letter, but by a small, unvarnished block of cedar wood from his new coastal site. It was his characteristic way of signaling that he was still anchoring foundations, still measuring weight and resistance, completely fulfilled by his solitary communion with the raw elements of the earth. Outside, the alleyway had become a pedestrian haven, its brick walls vibrating with the rich, texturized life of Marc's completed masterpiece. The gold leaf he had layered over the structural scar of the masonry had weathered the winter beautifully, now catching the high noon sun and throwing a soft, liquid brilliance down the cobblestones like a permanent golden ribbon. Marc sat on the stone steps of his studio across the street, a charcoal stylus moving across a large canvas sheet with a slow, meditative fluidness that was entirely devoid of his old, defensive speed. His new series of sketches did not depict the frantic, fleeting impressions of a traveler looking for an escape. They focused on the permanent, shifting patterns of light hitting the theater's facade, capturing the deep architecture of a place he had finally chosen to call home. He didn't look up when the theater doors opened, but his hand moved instinctively to the empty space on the bench beside him, his fingers waiting to intertwine with Elena's in the warm, bright air of the noon hour. Across the street, the heavy velvet drapes of Simone's balcony apartment had been permanently removed, replaced by sheer linen panels that billowed gently in the summer breeze. The old diva sat by her open terrace railing, her frail hands resting on the stone ledge, her sharp profile softened by the radiant summer light. The grand piano inside her parlor remained silent, but the small wicker basket on her doorstep was filled today with fresh cherries from the market, a vibrant splash of crimson waiting for Marc's daily visit. She had stepped out of the shadow of her own bitter legends, choosing instead to become a silent, benevolent witness to the life unfolding below her window. As the city clocks began their deep, resonant tolling for midday, filling the valley of the street with a profound harmony, the three survivors stood firmly rooted in the landscape of their shared redemption, completely at peace within the architecture of the tomorrow they had built together from the ruins. Chapter 18, The Unbroken Horizon. The late afternoon sun of the high summer began its slow, majestic descent over the city, stretching the long, clean silhouettes of the restored rooftops across the cobblestones of the alleyway. The air was perfectly still, thick with the nostalgic scent of warm tar, dried lavender, and the bitter, familiar tang of the French vermouth that Simone still kept on her side table across the street. Inside the Renaissance Theater, the massive glass skylight had been treated with a subtle, modern tint that softened the blinding glare of the June meridian, casting a serene, aquatic blue light over the empty rows of the orchestra stalls. Elena walked slowly down the center aisle, her fingertips brushing the cool, dark velvet of the seats she had spent a year protecting. The frantic, desperate momentum that had defined the project from its inception had completely dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant stillness that matched the steady heartbeat of the city outside. The theater was no longer a battleground of competing desires, it had become an oasis of quiet memory, its restored walls holding the history of their shared survival like a sacred vault. Her gaze naturally traveled up to the lobby entrance, where the permanent display of Julien's structural blueprints caught a stray beam of golden light. Those lines, drawn with such unyielding, mechanical certainty during the darkest moments of the previous year, had become the true foundation of her creative freedom. Elena felt a deep, quiet ache of gratitude that was entirely free of the old, paralyzing guilt that had once threatened to tear her apart. Julien's journey had taken him even further into the wild geographies of the world. A brief, formal letter from his firm had arrived at the theater's administrative office earlier that week, detailing his appointment to a massive deep-sea tunnel project in the cold waters off the Scandinavian coast. He had enclosed a small, smooth piece of grey granite from the northern fjords, no personal note, no lingering questions, merely the raw stone and his official, flawless signature on the completion seals. It was his ultimate, wordless testament to a love that had always been built to withstand the heaviest pressures of time and distance, a silent anchor that kept her world steady from afar. Outside the stage doors, the alleyway had settled into the warm, lazy rhythm of a summer evening, the brick walls radiating the stored heat of the long afternoon. Marc sat on the low stone wall beneath his completed mural, his dark hair catching the golden light as he methodically cleaned his brushes in a small metal tin. The massive artwork had become a permanent landmark in the neighborhood, its sweeping bands of ochre and slate gray blending seamlessly into the historic architecture, while the central ribbon of gold leaf burned with a fierce, liquid brilliance under the setting sun. He was no longer the defensive, volatile nomad who had arrived in the city looking for a place to burn his bridges. His movements were slow, grounded, and entirely at peace with the gravity of the space he had chosen to inhabit. He didn't look up when Elena's shadow lengthened across the cobblestones toward him, but his hand moved instinctively along the stone ledge, his paint-stained fingers opening in a silent, welcoming gesture that required no spoken vows to declare its absolute certainty. Across the narrow passage, the tall linen curtains of Simone's balcony fluttered gently in the evening breeze, throwing soft, shifting patterns of light across her terrace floorboards. The old diva sat in her high-backed chair, her frail shoulders wrapped in a simple white silk shawl, her sharp, intelligent profile illuminated by the dying embers of the sunset. She was no longer watching the street with the predatory, calculating intensity of a director orchestrating a tragedy. She had become a quiet, content participant in the reality of the present. A heavy, antique silver tray sat on her terrace table, holding a fresh pitcher of ice water and a small bowl of wild strawberries from the morning market, a simple, daily offering that Marc would cross the street to share with her once the twilight deepened. As the distant city bells began to chime for the hour, filling the warm air with a profound, harmonious resonance, the three survivors remained firmly rooted in the beautiful, unfolding landscape of their redemption, completely at peace within the unbroken horizon they had built together from the ruins. Chapter 19, The Indigo Equinox. The late summer heat wave finally broke as September made its entrance, pulling a cool, velvet twilight over the city earlier each evening. The transition was marked by a sudden, clean clarity in the air, a crispness that carried the faint scent of roasting chestnuts from the grand boulevards and the sharp, clean aroma of the morning mist rising off the river. Inside the Renaissance Theatre, the atmosphere had settled into a state of permanent grace. The modern glass skylight overhead reflected a deep, shifting mosaic of indigo and violet as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an elegant, shadowed net over the empty orchestra stalls. Elena stood at the highest point of the technical catwalk, high above the stage, her fingers lightly trailing along the newly installed steel support cables. There was no longer any dust to clean, no emergency bracing to monitor, and no structural failure to fear. Her role had evolved from a frantic savior into a quiet guardian, a caretaker of a space that had successfully learned how to breathe again after its long, suffocating trial. From this aerial height, she could look straight down into the warm, illuminated glass of the ground floor lobby, where Julien's framed blueprints caught the soft glow of the interior spotlights. Those technical drawings had become more than just a historical record of the reconstruction, they were the physical manifestation of a clean, uncompromised devotion that had saved them all without demanding anything in return. Julien's life had continued its steady, northward trajectory, far away from the emotional complications of the city center. A heavy cardboard tube had arrived at the theater's box office earlier that week, sent from his firm's new field office on the rugged, windswept coast of Scotland, where he was directing the construction of a massive tidal energy turbine array. Inside was a complete set of final, long-term vibration assessments for the theater's foundations, accompanied by a small, salt-encrusted pebble from the North Sea. It was his signature, wordless way of letting her know that he was still tracking the stability of her world, anchoring his own life in the raw, predictable laws of physics, completely at peace with the vast distance he had chosen to maintain. Down on the cobblestones of the alleyway, the evening shadows had completely swallowed the pavement, but Marc's completed mural seemed to generate its own internal light. The broad, texturized bands of slate gray and deep ochre had weathered the seasonal transitions perfectly, anchoring the brickwork to the street, while the central ribbon of gold leaf shimmered with an intense, molten warmth under the glow of the newly installed street lamps. Marc had spent the entire afternoon inside his studio across the way, his latest oil canvases moving away from the stark, fragmented architectural lines of his early work toward softer, more organic depictions of the city's changing light. He stepped out into the cool air of the alley, a charcoal pencil tucked behind his ear, his paint-dusted boots moving with a slow, deliberate calmness that was a beautiful contrast to the erratic, defensive energy of his past nomadic life. He didn't call out to Elena as she descended the theater's side stairs, but his posture softened immediately, his hand resting openly on the low iron railing of the entrance, his fingers waiting to close around hers with a quiet, unconditional certainty that required no grand dramatic declarations to prove its permanence. Across the narrow passage, the tall glass doors of Simone's balcony remained wide open to the autumn breeze, the heavy velvet drapes permanently packed away in favor of light linen panels that floated like ghosts in the twilight. The old diva sat in her high-backed wicker chair, a soft woolen blanket draped over her knees, her sharp, aristocratic profile silhouetted against the warm amber light of her parlor lamp. She had entirely abandoned her opera glasses and her silent, calculating observation of the block. Instead, she spent her evenings listening to the muffled, symphonic sounds of the orchestra tuning up inside the theater lobby, a serene, peaceful smile softening the deep lines of her face. A delicate porcelain tea service sat on her iron table, holding a freshly brewed pot of chamomile and a small plate of dark chocolate biscuits, a quiet, daily invitation for Marc and Elena to cross the cobblestones once the final curtains fell. The crucible of the past year had completed its work, burning away the illusions, the anger, and the heavy walls of isolation, leaving the three survivors to live their lives fully in the beautiful, unfolding architecture of their shared peace. Chapter 20, The Permanent Light. The arrival of October brought a deep, golden finality to the city, wrapping the historic district in a crisp, brilliant clarity that made every stone cornice and iron railing appear beautifully defined against the pale blue sky. A full year had transpired since the first cracks had formed in the foundation of the Renaissance Theatre, and the cycle of seasons had finally burned away the last remnants of the old wreckage. Inside the grand auditorium, the atmosphere was no longer defined by the frantic dust of reconstruction or the heavy, suffocating anxiety of a looming collapse. The modern glass and steel skylight overhead stood completely clear, tracking the slow, majestic passage of an autumn sun that flooded the entire space with a warm, steady radiance. Elena stood at the very center of the empty stage, her boots resting firmly on the polished oak floorboards, her hands empty of her restoration tools. Her work was finished. The ancient frescoes on the proscenium arch looked down upon the rows of velvet seats with a restored, quiet dignity, no longer surviving as decaying relics of a forgotten era, but living alongside the modern architecture that had saved them. The ghost of their shared trial had transformed into a monument of unyielding strength, completely free from the weight of regret. In the main lobby, the framed engineering schematics drawn by Julien during the height of the summer heatwave had become a permanent sanctuary for the eyes of every visitor who entered the building. Elena paused before the glass frame one last time, her heart entirely light, feeling only a profound, crystalline gratitude for the man who had physically held the ceiling aloft when her world was breaking apart. Julien's life had settled into its own grand, solitary rhythm far to the north. A final, official certification document had arrived from his corporate headquarters earlier that week, bearing his clean, unsmudged signature beside the long-term stability seals for the theater's central trusses. He was currently directing a massive deep-water pier infrastructure project in the fjords of Norway, anchoring heavy concrete pylons into the freezing granite seabed. He was precisely where he was meant to be, dedicating his life to the predictable, honest laws of physics, completely at peace with the vast, quiet distance he had chosen to place between himself and the city. Down in the cobblestone alleyway below, the evening shadows were beginning to stretch across the pavement, but Marc's completed mural seemed to capture and hold the very last rays of the setting sun. The broad, texturized bands of slate gray and rich ochre had become a seamless part of the neighborhood's identity, while the central ribbon of gold leaf, layered carefully over the masonry scar where the timber had once fallen, burned with a steady, liquid brilliance that illuminated the entire passage like a permanent sunrise. Marc had spent the late afternoon hours inside his studio across the way, his latest oil canvases moving entirely away from the frantic, fragmented lines of his nomadic youth toward deep, layered landscapes that explored the permanent relationship between stone and light. He stepped out into the cool autumn air, his paint-dusted boots moving with a slow, deliberate calmness that was the beautiful antithesis of the volatile energy he had carried a year ago. He didn't call out to Elena as she stepped through the side stage doors to join him, but his hand moved instinctively along the stone bench, his fingers opening in a silent, welcoming gesture that required no spoken vows to declare its absolute, grounded certainty. Across the narrow passage, the tall glass doors of Simone's balcony were propped wide open, the heavy velvet drapes of her old isolation permanently replaced by sheer linen panels that caught the fresh evening breeze. The old diva sat in her high-backed wicker chair, a thick cashmere shawl draped over her emerald silk robe, her sharp, aristocratic profile bathed in the warm amber glow of her parlor hearth. She was no longer watching the street through opera glasses or calculating the movements of a tragedy. She had stepped out of the shadow of her own bitter legends to become a peaceful, benevolent witness to the reality of the present. A delicate porcelain tea service sat on her iron table, holding a freshly brewed pot of Earl Grey and a small plate of honey pastries, a quiet, daily ritual of invitation that Marc and Elena would cross the cobblestones to share with her as soon as the twilight deepened into night. The long crucible of the year had completed its work, burning away the illusions, the walls, and the heavy isolation, leaving the three survivors firmly rooted in the beautiful, unfolding architecture of a tomorrow they had finally built together in the light.